Welcome to the Complete Beginner's Guide for Genesys RPG. This video is the start of a series to go through the entire core rulebook for Genesys, from start to finish, breaking down all of the game's core rules and mechanics. This is the Tabletop Empire, my name is Nate, and today we're jumping right into Chapter 1. This video is sponsored by our brand new website and merch store. We have super comfortable shirts, hoodies, hats, even phone cases. Head to thetabletopempire.com and use the limited time code Genesys for 10% off your entire order. So for anybody who doesn't know, Genesys RPG is an any setting tabletop role-playing game made by Edge Studios, formerly Fantasy Flight Games. This is a sequel of sorts to their narrative dice game Star Wars RPG and shares a lot of the same game mechanics and rules. However, for this series, I'm going to approach it like this is your first time experiencing a tabletop RPG system like this. If you want to know like a broad overview of the system, I recommend watching this video in one of the corners. However, if you want a specific guide to the rules and how to play, then stay here, this is where you want to be. As I said before, in this video we will be covering Chapter 1 of the core rulebook, which is going to include the dice and the story points. So let's start with the dice. Where in other games like D&D they have a dice with numbers, this game has narrative dice, which instead have symbols. Looking at them, they can be a little bit scary looking, but they're easy to get the hang of and they're super fun to use. Pretty much how they work is that there are some good dice and there are some bad dice. The good dice have good symbols on them and you roll a certain amount based on your characteristics, such as your brawn or agility or intellect, combined with your skills, such as athletics, stealth, or knowledge. The better your characteristics and skills are, the more good dice you get. And whenever you want to do anything in the game that has a chance of failure, you roll what's called a skill check, and the harder the thing you want to do is, the more bad dice are added. Then you roll both the good dice and the bad dice, and then the good and bad symbols cancel each other out, and whatever is left over will determine on how well you succeeded or how badly you failed at doing the thing. So let's explain each part of this, starting with the green dice. These are going to be your ability dice and are the standard good dice. The upgraded version of them is the yellow proficiency die. These give you better odds of good symbols than the green dice. The blue dice are called boost die. These have a chance to add good symbols to your roll and are used when there is a narrative reason for why a check may be slightly easier. For example, let's say you're trying to climb a wall and you find some boxes to climb on and it makes it a little bit easier. You can also get boost die through your character's abilities called talents. Now the opposite of the green dice is the purple dice, and that's also called the difficulty dice. You roll more or less of these depending on how hard the thing you're trying to do is. The upgraded version of the difficulty die are the red challenge die. And the opposite of the boost die, we have the black setback die, which are for when narrative reasons a check may be a little bit harder. Remember that wall we were trying to climb earlier? Well, it's raining and slippery, so add 2 setback dice. Next are the symbols on the dice. There are a total of 6 symbols, 3 good and 3 bad. First, we have success and failure, which cancel each other out. So if you roll and have 2 success and 1 failure, your result is 1 success. More than 1 success means that whatever you're trying to do is more successful. 0 success means that the check fails, as well as 1 or more failure left over means you fail. However, failure does not stack like success does, so 0 success, 1 failure, 10 failure, it's all the same thing. Next, we have advantage and threat, which cancel each other out. These are extra modifiers to the roll that do not determine the success or failure of the check, but instead provide other bonus effects and narrative to the result. For example, you succeed at a check trying to fix a motorcycle with 1 success, but you roll 2 threats. So maybe you succeeded at fixing the bike, but maybe it was more of a patch job and it can't reach its normal max speed. Or maybe you try to find a secret switch to find a hidden room, but you fail the check, but roll an advantage. So maybe you find a hint or a clue, or maybe a different helpful item that you weren't necessarily trying to find. Last but not least are triumph and despair. These have 2 parts to them bundled together. The first part is they count as 1 success or 1 failure, respectively, to be calculated with the final roll results. The second part is that they are a massive size advantage or threat and have major narrative implications. Think of that like a nat 20 or a nat 1 if you're playing D&D. This part does not cancel each other out. So if you roll both in 1 roll, you would have to have a major good narrative event and a major bad narrative event, and a bad narrative major event. Man, that's a tongue twister. So if your player rolls a triumph while trying to break into a computer, maybe they're able to access the entire network and leave no trace of their infiltration. Or if they instead had rolled a despair, maybe they alert security to their exact terminal and trap themselves into the room. Or if both were rolled on the same roll, they find all the info that they were looking for, but they tripped security and every room is on lockdown. However, the player was able to mask their exact location. The last thing to cover is how many dice does one roll. This is determined by what skill is being rolled for and the player's stat on that skill and its corresponding characteristic. The bigger number of the two is how many green dice you roll, and the smaller number of the two is how many are replaced with yellow die. So for an athletics check to climb that wall, if you had 4 brawn and 2 athletics, you would grab 4 green dice and replace 2 of them with yellow. Let's say you had 4 brawn and 0 athletics, then you'd just roll 4 green. Last example, let's say you have 2 athletics and 1 brawn. And you'd still grab 2 green and replace 1 with yellow, because the bigger number is 2 and the smaller number is 1. Now the difficulty is determined with purple dice. 0 difficulty dice means that the check should never ever really fail, and the only time you'd ever even roll this is if there's some sort of narrative setback where you'd maybe only roll against setback dice. This almost never happens. 1 difficulty die means the check is easy and there's a small chance of failure, but generally anyone should have a good chance of succeeding. 2 would be an average or medium difficulty, 3 would be hard, 4 would be daunting, and 5 would be formidable. Then you would determine if there's any boosts or setbacks for narrative reasons on why the check may be slightly easier or harder than usual, or if the player has any special talents giving them boost die or a moving setback. Then you grab your handful of dice and roll, and you calculate the results by canceling out symbols. So let's do that climbing a wall check from before. You have 3 brawn, 1 athletics, so you roll 3 dice and 1 is upgraded to yellow. The GM says that its average difficulty is going to be 2 difficulty dice. It's raining, so add 2 setback dice, but your character gets 1 boost die to all athletics checks. Then you roll, you cancel out all the symbols, look at the results, and interpret it. Now there are 2 terms you may see involving skill checks, and that is upgrading and downgrading. This most commonly happens when spending story points, which we will touch on later in the video. Upgrading is when you upgrade a green die to a yellow die. If all dice are already yellow, then you would add another green die, and then if you had a second upgrade, that green die would become a yellow die, and so on and so forth. Upgrading can also be when you upgrade the purple difficulty die to a red challenge die. Downgrading is when a yellow becomes a green or a red becomes a purple. However, you can never lose the amount of dice. If you're all green or all purple, downgrades will have no effect. If you have upgrades and downgrades in the same check, apply all upgrades first and then all downgrades. On top of skill checks, there are other kinds of checks that have unique rules. The first is the opposed check. This is when you make a check against another character. So if your player tries to lie to an NPC, you would roll dice for your deception against the NPC's dice for vigilance, but converted to purple and reds. So if an NPC's vigilance was 1 yellow and 1 green, you would be rolling your deception against 1 purple and 1 red. The other kind of check is the competitive check, for when your characters are trying to accomplish goals at the same time. So let's say, for example, 2 players wanted to have an arm wrestle. In this case, the GM would determine the best skill for the scenario, probably athletics, and then choose the difficulty, which both players roll at the same check. Whoever rolls the most successes wins, ties are broken by triumph, then advantage, and if it's still tied, then it's a draw. If both players fail at the check, then it's also a draw. The last kind of a check is the assisted check. There are both skilled assistance and unskilled assistance. Skilled assistance is when a player with a higher characteristic or skill rating try to help another player's check, when possible within the narrative. In this case, the check would use one character's characteristic and another character's skill rating. Unskilled assistance is if the player has a lower or tied skill rating and characteristic, and in this case the player would add 1 boost die to their check. And that is all for the dice. Now on to other key elements of the game, talents and story points. But first, if this is helpful so far, please do me a favor and blast like and subscribe. It's free and it really helps out the channel. Talents are pretty much going to be your player's active and passive abilities, and they can be used in certain situations. You will build your own talent pyramid in character creation, which comes later in this series. And then story points are tokens in the game that allow players to alter their destiny a little bit. So think of it as a way for players to access bite-sized GM powers. So there are 2 pools of story points. One belongs to the players and one belongs to the GM. At the beginning of each session, the player pool gets 1 story point for each player and 1 story point in the GM pool. And throughout the game, the GM will spend points from the GM pool, the players will spend points from the player pool, and so when a point is spent from one pool, it gets moved to the other pool for the other side to be able to spend. You can only use 1 story point per action, and the point is only moved to the opposite pool after its corresponding action is resolved. However, the GM and the players can use a story point in the same check. So what do these points actually do? You can spend 1 point to upgrade a green die to a yellow die. You can increase the difficulty of an enemy's check by upgrading a purple die to a red die. Some talents require spending a story point, as well as you can use story points to conveniently find exactly what you're looking for or to retcon the story a bit. So like if you forgot to buy a gas mask and entered a toxic sewer, then you could use a story point to be like, oh yeah, I totally had a gas mask in my bag. Beyond these options, it is up to the GM. Personally, I allow for bigger allowances with the story points. even if I have to tell the players that they maybe have to spend more than one story point to do so. But again, this is kind of up to the GM. Everything we've covered here is rules as written. However, I find the story points works best when you allow the players to have a little bit more power with them. So the end of chapter 1 goes into experience points and derived attributes, but honestly I think it's better to cover that during character creation in chapter 2, which is going to be our next video. If you have any questions from this video, ask below. I'll do my best to answer every comment. And if you want to see more Star Wars RPG or Genesis content, consider subscribing. A huge thanks to the Patreon supporters. You guys are amazing and are super duper appreciated. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video, but until then, and as always, may the Force be with you.